Good morning, everyone. My name's Barber and I'm the Planning Director at Radiocentre. And I have to say, it's great to be back on a stage again, especially one that isn't being chased by a bunch of angry Indigenous Americans on horseback across the high plains. But enough of my private life. You may feel that it's strange talking about the road to recovery when we've only just officially entered recession. However, as the Chinese proverb states, even the longest journey starts with a single step. So at this stage, we may be uncertain about how deep this recession will be and how long it will last. But there's a really important role for research here to help advertisers respond to changing attitudes and behaviours to ensure that their brands come out the other side in the best possible shape. So in this session, Kamilah and I will be talking you through the latest in 3 waves of Radiocentre's COVID audience research, comparing data to previous waves in April and May, and exploring the potential challenges and opportunities that exist for brands as this recession unfolds. It's a story of new habits evolving from upheaval, of emerging resilience, and of course, radio advertising. So let's start by having a look what's happened with listening patterns since lockdown began.
Hello, I am Kamilah Kamara and I am the Insight Manager at Radiocentre. As you will have heard earlier, commercial radio listeners are listening to more radio than they were before lockdown. So in our study back in April, we found that 38% of commercial radio listeners were listening to more radio, and that's now 36%. So that stayed stable. When we look at how much more time people are spending with the radio, that has reduced when you compare it to April, but people are still listening to an extra hour and a half every single day. So perhaps new habits are being formed. In our previous 2 pieces of work, we've established 3 key audience groups. Newly working from home, those are people that used to work primarily from an office and then went on to work primarily from home. The key workers, those are nurses, doctors, people on the front lines, grocery workers, people that have been working throughout the crisis. And then the furloughed group. These are people that were newly at home, just like the working from home group, but they were unable to work either because their work was deemed non-essential or they were furloughed. But as we move through the crisis, a new working group has emerged, the newly returning to work group. Now, these are people that were either furloughed or working from home that have started to transition back into the workplace. So as we move through the rest of this presentation, you'll notice that there are 4 groups that we'll talk about. Now, in our last piece of work that looked at listening behaviour, we saw that the working from home group was the group that was most likely to have increased their listening, and that has remained the same. 50% of the working from home group have increased their listening versus pre-lockdown levels, and they're followed by the furloughed group at 42%. Now, you can very much see this in action when we look at location in listening and how that has changed. We can see really strong uplifts in listening at home and in the garden, and this is driven primarily by those working from home, although actually we see positive uplifts across all of the groups. So we can see very much that listening levels have sustained when we compare it to April, but we can also see that habits have changed, and it'll be interesting to see how these develop further as we move through this crisis. Okay, so let's take a look at what commercial radio listeners are spending their money on. What are their shopping habits like now? Now, in our last piece of work, Bounce Back and Beyond, we explored spend intentions among commercial radio listeners. And what we found was that the very things that they were most excited to spend money on, the things that they intended to spend their money on, were the things that were most heavily impacted by lockdown. Socialising in bars and pubs, going to restaurants, travelling both internationally and domestically. Those were the things that commercial radio listeners said that they were intending to spend money on. So in this newest piece of research, we asked commercial radio listeners to look retrospectively at what they had spent money on. And we can see very much that the things that they ended up spending money on didn't necessarily line up with the spend intentions. So bars and pubs, restaurants, travel, those things actually, spend wasn't realised in those areas. Now, some things will have been impacted by restrictions. So, for example, certain beauty treatments weren't available during the period of time or for the entire period of time. But overall, overall it seems like there was something else causing them to not actually go out and splash out like they thought they would. And in fact, the areas that people were more likely to spend money on were things that did not require social mixing, so product purchases, things like clothing and footwear and DIY. Now let's explore some of those shopping habits in a bit more detail. So there's been very much a move towards supporting the local economy. We can see that just under a third of people are spending more money in their local area than they were before lockdown. And this is being driven very much by the working from home group, who are more likely to be spending more time in their area than ever before. Another new habit that's come about is the move towards online shopping. Unsurprisingly, during lockdown, there was very much a move towards online shopping, both for grocery and even more so for other retail. What's interesting too is that we can see that while grocery online shopping has declined slightly post-lockdown, it continues to grow for other retail, suggesting more new habits have been developed here. It's also worth noting, and probably unsurprising, that during lockdown, in-store shopping was hit quite badly and declined quite significantly. But there are some small indications that perhaps we are starting to move back towards a high street. So how can radio help advertisers? Well, radio is an extremely effective medium in helping people boost both in-store and online effects. Radio boosts online browsing by 52%, as well as boosting purchase intent in-store by 30%. So we've looked back now at the changing habits of commercial radio listeners, both in terms of their listening and in terms of their shopping. Now let's look forward towards the recession.
So having reviewed those habits, how do consumers feel about how the recession is going to impact on their attitudes, finances and spending behaviour? So starting with finances, this chart shows the number of people who agree with these statements which relate to how the recession could affect them. And we can see from this that clearly there are a lot of concerns about money and also concerns about job security. And these in turn are also creating a certain degree of uncertainty about the future. Now, unsurprisingly, people who have been furloughed are most likely to have financial concerns, whereas key workers who have been working throughout have the least money worries. So these concerns about money are also impacting people's attitudes towards shopping, with many predicting that they will be switching from premium brands to budget brands and also putting off major purchases. And that is particularly true of people who have been furloughed again and also those who have been working from home since lockdown began. But there's also a majority that feel they're going to be spending a lot more leisure time at home, presumably to save money. Interestingly, key workers are the least likely group to be changing their behaviour in this way. So we can see how these attitudes are influencing people's projected spending behaviour in this chart, which shows the proportion of people who are intending to spend more or the same on a range of categories during the recession compared to those who are planning to spend less or put purchases on hold. Now, broadly speaking, it follows a similar but more downbeat pattern to the recent post-lockdown spending that Kamilah talked through earlier. And again, because more people are intending to spend time at home, this impacts more on activities than it does on products. Also important to note the challenges to big ticket items such as technology, furniture and holidays, which all reflects people's intention to put big purchases on hold. Behind these headlines, it's reassuring that key workers across the board, their spending is more resilient, and we also see that those returning to work are also likely to continue to spend more on products as well. But I think this chart sort of highlights that there is going to be a challenge for businesses in the year ahead. But actually, I think there's also potentially some light at the end of the tunnel. So firstly, even though people broadly accept that money is going to be tight, a significant proportion are still prepared to splash out on treating themselves and their family on as many occasions as they can. And that's great news because that means discretionary spend is still happening, even if the definition of a treat will vary from person to person. More interestingly for advertisers in this context, commercial radio listeners are 57% more likely to be spending on treating than non-listeners. Secondly, upheaval from COVID has shaken up sort of deeply ingrained purchase habits and encouraged people to experiment with brands a bit more. So as this chart shows, since the beginning of lockdown, 30% of commercial radio listeners have tried a new brand, and that's 25% higher than non-listeners to commercial radio. So this is a great opportunity for brands to encourage competitors to try their brand, but also they need to sort of put some action in place to prevent their current customers from switching to their competitors as well. So what causes switching? Well, beyond offering better value for money or being easy to find online, one of the main reasons that people gave for switching brands was hearing or seeing advertising for the brand. And again, showing the value of commercial radio audience, listeners are 54% more likely to be influenced by advertising in this way. So bearing all of these things in mind, if an advertiser is thinking they want to harness some of commercial radio's influence for themselves, what can they expect to get out of the other side? Well, analysis of 775 campaigns measured on Radio Gauge demonstrate how commercial radio can boost overall campaign outcomes across a range of different metrics, including ad awareness, brand relevance, and brand consideration. Perhaps more importantly, for advertisers marketing during a recession, radio really delivers on the bottom line. Radio's ROI, as this chart shows, is second only to TV, paying back £1.61 profit for every pound invested. And finally, for those advertisers who are seeking to exploit atypical conditions during the recession to help grow market share, it's important to know that campaigns that use radio can grow market share 4 times faster than those that don't, as this chart using IPA data demonstrates. So that effectively concludes this brief tour of listening and behaviour during COVID and beyond. But just to briefly summarise the main points. Firstly, we've seen that listening has adapted as lifestyles have changed, yet listening remains higher than it was pre-lockdown. Secondly, we've identified some challenges, mainly coming from uncertainty about the future, which is likely to inhibit spending across some categories, particularly activities and holidays, major purchases. However, there is some sort of light at the end of the tunnel as well. Firstly, we see that attitudes among key workers and those returning to work are more resilient to the trials ahead, and they're more likely to maintain or increase their spending on certain products and categories. Despite a small shift back towards the high street, we've seen that local spending and online spending have become really important marketplaces. And we know that radio can really help advertisers exploit these very, very effectively. And finally, commercial radio listeners are much more likely to try new products and be influenced by advertising. And so there's a whole raft of data which demonstrates how radio, harnessed in this way, can drive both short-term ROI and also long-term market share growth. So that's about it. If anyone would like to find out more about the research covered in this presentation or any other aspects, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much for listening. Hope to see you again in person soon.